All right, thank you so much for staying with Daybreak. Let's start that conversation on the Africa Climate Summit, the resolutions, the hits and the misses at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Daybreak. That's how you'd like to reach us, and we'd like to hear your views on every single subtopic we're going to talk about right here in studio. Let me introduce my guest one more time, Cecilia Kinuthia-Njenga, Director Intergovernmental Support at the UNFCCC, that is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Thank you very much for making time. Dr. Kevin Kariuki, Vice President, Power, Energy, Climate, Green Growth at the Africa Development Bank. Thank you very much for making time. Nasra Nanda, CEO, Kenya Green Building Society. Asante sana for making time. And last but not least, Dr. Ahmed Idris, Secretary General, Kenya Red Cross. Thank you very much for making time as well. Let's start with Nasra. What is your assessment of the Africa Climate Summit outcomes? Was the hits and misses?
Thank you so much for your question, Trevor. So for me, I think, firstly, the intention, I think, was great. Bringing together Africa to direct solutions for Africans by Africa and taking charge of its narrative was awesome. So there are some important wins from it. Firstly, the new financial architecture conversation, saying that Africa needs a fairer set of terms for it from a finance perspective, that I'm fully aligned with. Second, the fact that there was, secured $23 billion, that is definitely a win for Africa, and how renewable energy has lobbied a lot of support. Really happy about that. However, from a built environment perspective, we talk a lot about infrastructure, but we forget the fundamental thing that is a key African problem, housing. And I think that was a fundamental miss of the Africa Climate Summit. With over 200 million Africans living in informal settlements, not having access to housing is a dignity issue for Africans, and not having that as a center point for this conversation is, in our opinion, very unfortunate, because without housing, everything else doesn't matter. If I don't have a home, how am I fighting for roads, energy, and the rest? So thank you.
Kariuki, what was your assessment?
I think it was a genuinely successful event in the sense that, first of all, we were able to unify Africa's voice as far as key issues are concerned. For example, the issue of decarbonization, which Nasra has alluded to. There is significant attention that has been drawn to the need to basically ramp up renewable energy generation as part of our efforts to combat climate change. That's number one. There was also the issue that there's increased voice towards support for MDB, Multilateral Development Bank reforms. And in this particular case, we have some very interesting things that we have been introduced for the first time. For example, the bank is the leading voice as far as rechanneling of special drawing rights are concerned. And this, I believe, will be transformative as far as increasing the amount of climate finance resources that are available on the continent to combat climate change. And thirdly, we made a strong case, and this was well received by the participants, the countries, including the representatives of the various countries and everybody else, on the call for revaluation of Africa's GDP based on its rich natural capital as well as biodiversity, especially considering that these aspects contribute to what we call a global good. If you look at unknown to many people, the Congo forest is actually a bigger sequester of carbon compared to even the Amazon, but there's more focus on Amazon. So we were able to profile this particular aspect, and I believe from, I would say, a bank perspective, the fact that we have obtained the support of the entire continent, number one, for the call for rechanneling of $100 billion, $1 billion for the SDRs for Africa, and the acceptance of revaluing or rebasing our economies based on natural capital as well as biodiversity is a very, very important success from my perspective.
Okay.
On the downside, I think we packed too much over 2.5 days. I think probably it could have been slightly longer to allow for more deliberate and more extensive discussions on the various very important topics. Thank you.
All right. Idris?
Yeah, I think it's a really successful conference, both in terms of content, the process. Maybe let me just start with, we've really cemented the role of Kenya in global climate diplomacy. I think that's just the first win for us as a country. And second, for the continent, we are more prepared than we were in the past COP, so COP27 and the previous COP. So that's the second major win. And the third one is in terms of the content. The declaration itself has placed the discussion that we are looking forward to in COP28, both in the context of past COPs, the reality of today, and the future of Africa. And that combined level of success means that it was really a good conference.
Okay. Cecilia?
I think the outcome of this African Climate Summit demonstrates the leadership of Africa. It demonstrated that Africa is ready to play in the multilateral process towards COP28. And in fact went a little bit deeper in terms of articulating very well what the challenges for Africa are. We know that Africa continues within the multilateral process, particularly towards COP28, to be one of the most vulnerable parts of the world. But I think for me, where I felt that a lot could have been said and done was around the whole issue of adaptation. The COP discussions have been very much skewed towards addressing issues of mitigation. And indeed, Africa, as President Ruto mentioned, offers an opportunity for ensuring that we are able to keep temperatures below the 1.5 degree mark by ensuring that nature continues to play an important role. You know, and as Ken has said, you know, the whole issue of the carbon sinks, the Congo Basin being very significant. However, we do know that the major concerns and the major issues and the vulnerabilities of our continent are with our people. Food security, water insecurity, the whole issue of energy poverty continues to linger within this continent. And providing that balance between responses in terms of mitigation and adaptation is basically where I feel that we have a few more months before COP28 to try and articulate as an African continent how we want to respond to the very needs of our people, whether it's in urban areas, whether it's in rural communities, and in fact, bringing in the demographic dividend of our young people to participate in the solutions to address the climate change challenge.
Yeah, and that's an interesting perspective you bring, Cecilia, the issue of adaptation versus mitigation. But there's something Sultan Al-Jabbar said, the president of COP28, and this is what he had to say in regards of whether we're actually winning this war or not, and where should we really emphasize, like Cecilia is talking about, adaptation or mitigation? Let's listen to this.
The world is losing the race to secure the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the world is struggling to keep 1.5 within reach. Collectively, we must admit that we are not delivering the results we need in the time we need them.
So, Cecilia, what results do we need and what timeframes are we looking at? Because according to Al-Jabbar, we are not winning this.
We are running out of time, Trevor. We are really running out of time. And I think for the African continent, we are seeing increased levels of food insecurity. As I said, we are seeing increased level of and prolonged periods of drought. We are seeing communities and families that are not able to put food on the table. And we are really running out of time. I think it is time now that we amplify where we need to focus. And for me, adaptation is the missing piece. We had a win in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, and loss and damage came on the table. At this COP, as we move towards COP28, we are looking for a bigger voice. We are looking for bigger demands, not only in a balance of adaptation and mitigation, but we are also talking about just transitions. And for me, just transitions puts the issue right on the table. we can talk about tripling renewable energy. We can talk about doubling energy efficiency, which is the language I'm hearing more and more coming onto the table.
Yeah.
But if we are not able to provide, and it's not just about qualifiers of dealing with the socioeconomic problems that the world is facing, but it's really genuinely placing the money where the needs are. The 100 billion has never been delivered fully.
Yeah.
We are still counting.
In 14 years.
In 14 years.
So what happens now, even though the Nairobi Declaration asks for it, but it's been 14 years, what's going to change?
We are talking about doubling adaptation finance,
Yeah.
but yet we are not articulating what we really need to do in order to address the gaps in the area of adaptation.
Okay.
There's so much talk about reducing carbon emissions and focusing on mitigation, but we really need to look and change the paradigm so that we start dealing with real economy issues that are impacting on real human beings.
Okay. So, Dr. Kariuki, according to you, and that's a very interesting perspective Cecilia is bringing in, should we focus on adaptation or mitigation?
I think the correct way, Cecilia is right.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that we know is that Africa's climate change is locked in for the next 20 years. So in other words, what that means, Trevor, even if we don't emit 1 ton of CO2 over the next 20 years, we will continue seeing the same extreme weather events that we are seeing in greater numbers and in more severe form. So I think the focus of Africa is on adaptation and resilient building. And this is only right if you consider that Africa accounts for only 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that is why, as a bank, our focus has been on adaptation. We are in sync with our resident member countries, regional member countries, that is our constituencies. So what we've done as a bank, last year, acknowledging that 9 out of 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are on the African continent, and that also translates to 35 out of 45 of the most vulnerable countries in the world are actually in Africa. What we did last year, we introduced what we call the Climate Action Window, which seeks to mobilize significant resources, up to $13 billion for climate change in these very vulnerable countries. That's number one. And number two, since we realize that as a bank we can only do so much, that's why we've come up with the issue of the special drawing rights, in order to be able to provide significant resources on the continent for purposes of climate action. But today, how do we measure the costs that are available for adaptation? I think, let me put it first of all this way. First of all, Africa only accounts for 4.5% of global climate finance. If we get into adaptation alone, it's only about $11 billion. I mean, which is a very, very small proportion, considering, for example, the total climate finance requirements for the continent is up to $277 billion per year between now and 2030. So what we are saying is that let us find ways of disaggregating what we need as adaptation. And it is very good because on the one hand, as the African continent, we are saying adaptation is where we should be focusing on. Because, as I said, the fact that we've contributed so little in emission, we cannot be even go much lower. So what we are saying is that now here we are. We need to improve on how we address adaptation. So what can we do? We looked at a bank and we said, how do we introduce something that is innovative for the continent? Yeah. And we came up with what we call Country Investment Adaptation Compacts. Because today, we can't say that we want support for adaptation on the continent. And the global north, or the better-to-do developed countries, will tell you where can we channel these resources. Mm-hmm. The thing is, we have our national determined contributions and our national adaptation plans, which are very high-level documents. So what we did is to disaggregate those NDCs, or national determined contributions, and national adaptation plans into what we call compacts. And at this summit, we were able to develop 7 what we call country investment adaptation compacts for certain 7 countries, including Kenya, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Mozambique, and 3 other countries.
Yeah.
So, but the idea here is so that when we are calling for the global community to double adaptation finance, as Cecilia mentioned, what we are saying, okay, instead of them saying, where do we invest? When they come to that, we will be developing this adaptation compacts between now and the COP28 and also next year, so that when they come to that, we tell them, here are the adaptation compacts. Yeah. For example, Kenya needs to focus on this particular area. Tanzania needs to focus on this particular area. So we are able to disaggregate the NDCs and NAPs into distinct projects that can be financed and therefore provide a channel for the resources that have been doubled by the international communities. Yeah. Let me stop there.
So Nasra, when you spoke about housing earlier on, what would you have wanted to hear? Because there's a lot of funding going around, but the focus is where the issue is. Where is this money all going to?
Thank you so much for your question, Trevor. So for me, my first, I would call it concern, is that, so we've said 23 billion, but we've not broken it down in the context of maybe industries, right? So key for me, because of my own bias, is the built environment. And it's a big concern because we have 1.4 billion people who will live in urban spaces in Africa by 2050. That's a huge volume of people. And when you think about it from an impact perspective, these 1.4 billion people were ignored in this declaration from a focus perspective, right? And also we need to consider the context of where we are in Africa. Largely, Africa is driven by SMEs. So when you think about solutions, you need to consider that many Africans, the backbone of Africa, are small to medium enterprises. And often those population sets will not be covered by these complex carbon-related conversations. They don't even understand it. I think we missed the opportunity to look at cities as an ecosystem of opportunities. And just the built environment is an ecosystem of opportunity. Let's look at Nairobi, for example. The GDP of Nairobi is at, I think, twice the size of the GDP of Rwanda. And so if you think about it, Nairobi as a city should have been looked at as an area of opportunity for Africa in driving a climate conversation. So I think in that regard, we're looking at informal settlements. Yes, we launched B Crop yesterday, but I didn't see that in the declaration in terms of, so what is the commitment for the urban poor population from a financing perspective? Because it is within cities that you have sanitation issues, you have housing and dignity issues, energy and water issues. Yeah. Fundamentally, housing is about dignity. And I feel that was what we missed, whether it's from an adaptation or mitigation perspective. Yeah. And what that translates to is that we could have utilized the Nairobi Declaration to mobilize sustainable finance, carbon finance, climate finance for cities, not just to create sustainable cities, but also to rehabilitate these cities. So without actually saying we are allocating a certain amount for that agenda, my concern is that we'll have a lot of disconnect that will not feed into impacting the lives of Africans on a day-to-day.
Yeah, and with that bias in having been considered the housing sector, because that's where you come from, so what does mitigation look like for them, or adaptation? Where would they focus more? Okay, so if you were to consider the built environment from a CO2 perspective, we are one of the largest, if not the largest emitter. So you're looking at about 39% CO2 comes from the built environment. So if you got the 39% right, aren't you ahead of the game? So looking at the numbers, for me, you would be looking at low carbon, buildings. Yeah, and it's not that there isn't fantastic work, Trevor, that's being done. Tomorrow we'll be having an event where Laikipia County will actually be committing and making an announcement around taking action for its building stock. So for me, it's a matter of what could we do different? We could have low carbon buildings as a way of channeling this. We could also be looking at creating climate resilient cities, which is actually
a fundamental key area of focus under the African Union Agenda 2063 and also Recovery Plan.
Yeah.
So my concern is that wasn't considered, so where does that leave us?
Okay. Yeah. And Idris, you're at the end of this, mostly mitigation purposes. What do you think the focus should be on, adaptation or mitigation?
Maybe just 3 comments.
Yeah.
One, Mr. Jabbar is right, 100% right. It looks like we're losing the battle. And he bases his conclusion on 2 things.
Yeah.
One is the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are not on target in both reduction of emission, and if we continue with this pace, it means we will not achieve the 1.5 degree target. That's the first issue. The second, if you look at a comparison between COP26 and COP27, there was a huge reduction in the commitment, especially of the developed countries, to reduce emissions. In fact, there's backtracking on that. That's the first one. The second one is that commitments that have been made on financing adaptation, financing climate finance as a whole, there's huge backtracking on that. As we speak today, only 10% of the funding available for adaptation is coming to where it is needed most, that is the local communities. So we should refuse to allow to reduce this discussion to an either-or question. I think that's important. Mitigation is important, adaptation is important. And really, this is the beauty of the declaration, Nairobi Declaration. It is extremely holistic. Yeah. It considers availing climate resources, but it also considers reorganizing the political economy of the world as a whole. You know, it considers putting measures for supporting climate risk reduction, but it also deeply, concludes that development gains, development finance, and climate finance should go hand in hand. And so if it was my view, one, as an institution that is working on disaster risk reduction, response, more resources need to be made available for local communities to adapt, to mitigate. Yeah. But more importantly, the global structure needs to be organized, one, for greater commitment to reduce emission, and for us to be truly committed to reaching the targets on global warming.
So why is it that only 10% gets to the places it is needed the most?
Oh, this is a really good question. But one, it has to do with the global aid system, first and foremost.
So the system is too...
Yeah. So generally speaking, about 4% of global aid comes to national mechanisms and national institutions. And that's, the main challenge that we have on resource flow, including resources that are meant to facilitate poor people to cope with the impacts of climate change, whether it is disaster response resources, whether it is recovery resources, or preparedness resources. So it's a global structure, and there's a huge conversation since 2015 during the World Humanitarian Summit about reorganizing, about localizing, availing more resources to national institutions such as Kenya Red Cross. But we are very far from the target. And this is why I think both Kenya, as a leader in this debate, and specifically His Excellency the President, has set the tone for a need to look at this question holistically. It's a systemic question. It is not just a question about emissions. It is not just a question about adaptation funding. There's a systemic problem that we need to address, and we hope that that will be done as we go to the COP28.
Is it just simply corruption?
Explain your question.
Is that where the problem is when you talk about resource flow and reorganization of it all? Are we simply saying that sometimes the money is there, but there's too many loopholes? Or that's the reason it's not reaching the entire
I think there are a series of problems. One is the targeting of institutions. That's the first problem. There's more resources going to international institutions such that by the time the money actually reaches where it is meant most, there's a huge costing on administration, on oiling the bureaucracy wheels. That's the first question.
Oiling the bureaucracy wheels.
True. The second main problem that we have right now is just the total funding that is available for developing countries. It's very little, and I think my colleagues have alluded to that. So it's a resource availability question of the funding that is coming here. 10% of resources coming to developing countries means it is going somewhere else. Yeah. Okay? The International Federation of the Red Cross, in one of their most recent research, concluded that of the 30 countries that are most affected by disasters, they are not in the 30 highest countries receiving adaptation funding. So it's a question of prioritization also on where the money is actually going. The concept of corruption and generally the architecture of public governance, of course, is a major issue without running away from the question. I think we generally need to improve how we utilize existing resources. We need to be more accountable. We need to dispense with, rent-seeking approaches to program implementation. And if you look at the Nairobi Declaration, there is a huge commitment to saying that we will reorganize our own countries to incentivize action, to attract resources, and to attract funding to help with both mitigation and adaptation.
Okay. All right, I have to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about that in just a bit. And there's some concerns from activists that we went to the doctor, we were given painkillers, we moved on. No diagnosis, nothing. That conversation coming up in just a bit. Also, keep your views coming at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Daybreak. See you in a bit.